and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and my co-host, as always, is Derek Cohen. He's our Chief of Research and Policy. All right, Derek. And by the way, I would just like to say at the top that I usually mess up those intros, and this is like, we got 10 or 15 shows in a row.
Why would you say something? Why do you put your hand on the Stanley Cup there, man?
Well, I'm just saying, I'm like, I just want to get a little credit for not having, Jefferson not having to edit it 15 times. It's like 10 or 15
congratulations on calling it into the streak.
All right, hot take right here at the beginning. Okay, we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and I'm not going to ask you what your favorite food is because I think we've done that one before. But I am curious. This is a political show. We talk about policy and politics here. So will you talk about, Derek? Will you talk about policy and politics at Thanksgiving with your family?
No.
Okay, moving on.
I very firm rule that don't talk shop with civilians.
Mm-hmm.
You always engage if somebody has a question asked in good faith. That they genuinely want to know the answer to. But it seems like more and more, folks want to just engage on something just for the sole purpose and not for understanding anything, right, or coming to a compromise of opinion and ideology. But it's more the uncle who wants to fight over what have you,
say their piece.
Yeah, and the thing is, and I could, with respect to Uncle Frank, I could not be any less concerned about what you think about any matter of policy, foreign and domestic.
For me, my issue is that both my sister and my brother-in-law are teachers and like public school teachers. And so obviously with TPPF being very involved in the school choice debate.
Mention.
Yeah, school choice. There we go. We were under keep today. But then them coming from the side we all know, which is like, they're getting it from the superintendents and the lobbyists and everything about how terrible school choice is going to be. It made for some interesting conversations now and then, or some text messages about how, Brian, what's going on here? And I'm like, well, let me tell you.
Well, that's the thing. You're like, you're the man for that communication, being able to massage it and sell it. I'm like, well, you see how it works in the parade. And it just does. It doesn't. It's not as easy after after 3 Bud Lights or what have you.
I've got all my talking points lined up and start using them at Thanksgiving. All right, so we will probably not talk about that. We have a new baby in the house, so she's 2 months old. So we'll probably talk a lot about that.
I thought you were going to talk to her about politics.
Oh yeah, already. I take my 3-year-old to go vote with me every time. She loves it. But yeah, we'll probably end up talking about the baby more.
Are her first words are going to be "Thanks, Biden," like something like that?
No, but she did sing karaoke for the first time last night. So So I'm very excited about that. She went and sang "Let It Go" at the karaoke place. I was
nice.
like, wow, yeah, her first public performance. All right, shameless plug is my favorite part of the show. If you're not subscribed to The Post, please go to texaspolicy.com/The Post. It is our weekly wrap up of everything TPPF's working on, things that are going on in Texas. There's some exclusive writings from me in there, so I'd love your feedback on that. And there's always something fun, something Texas related at the end that's written by the great John Mondi. So go to texaspolicy.com/The Post and subscribe to that today. Okay, and now for less fun things. We are super excited to have 2 guests with us today. Woke ideology is seeping into the healthcare system, unfortunately. It doesn't just shape the way doctors communicate, it shapes diagnoses, treatments, and ultimately patient safety. When political narratives dictate what doctors can say, what studies can be cited, or which questions are allowed, patients lose. The Texas Medical Association has become increasingly politicized, especially after recent bylaw changes empowered it to advocate for gender identity politics. The shift created tension between evidence-based medicine and ideological activism. Between 2022 and 2023, multiple TMA members warned leadership that this activism did not reflect the priorities of most physicians and could violate the board members' fiduciary duties, but the board failed to act. This isn't just an internal political fight within a professional association. These policies shape what lawmakers hear, what courts rely on, and ultimately how doctors treat patients. When ideology replaces science, the public pays the price. So today we're speaking with 2 experts who can help us unpack what's going on. Our first guest is Dr. Lisa Ehrlich. She's a doctor of internal medicine and former trustee at the Texas Medical Association. She wrote a recent piece in the Dallas Morning News warning that TMA has been captured by gender ideology. Her piece was based on a report authored by our second guest. Joseph Figliolia is a policy analyst at the Manhattan Institute, where he specializes in research literature on gender dysphoria and gender-affirming care. Dr. Ehrlich, Joseph, welcome to The Right Idea.
Thank you for having us.
All right, Joe, since you wrote the report, we will first start with you. A lot of these reports, Manhattan Institute does a lot of national issues, but you focus specifically on the Texas Medical Association in your report. Was there a particular event or something or data point, like what triggered you to focus specifically on them?
I would say two reasons. One was I initially heard about the 2025 House of Delegates session in which a policy to review TMA's current policies on affirming care was, despite testimony from members in favor of this policy, basically it was shut down and the organization refused to kind of survey, do a kind of audit of their existing affirming care policy, which states that the organization is, in favor of affirming care and that it should be made accessible to people solely based on gender identity. And I was curious by how in, the year 2025, after you have medical practice reversals abroad, you have the release of an HHS report on pediatric gender dysphoria, how it is that an organization can kind of claim that there is a reliable evidence base for affirming care. And that's one angle. And then, of course, another angle is it's really hard to kind of to get a window into the internal processes of medical associations. And so there's a pragmatic angle, which is that there were concerned members of the TMA that were willing to speak with us and give us some insight into kind of the internal processes. And so having an opportunity to kind of look into the actual materials and then develop kind of a working theory of what's happening.
Did it surprise you? The whole gender ideology, phenomenon has been, the tide has really been turning and turning quickly. I think at least since 2020 or 2021. It's obviously now 2025, and we've got laws popping up all over the country, modeling on things like SB 14, right there. Yep. SB 14 preventing kids from having these kinds of surgeries. So the tide's really been turning, and yet were you surprised to find out that an organization like TMA appears to be doubling down on this stuff?
No, I wouldn't say I was surprised, because at the current juncture, there's only very few medical organizations, aside from maybe one, have not really basically almost every single medical organization in the United States supports the affirming care model and continues to support it. And that's one of the, I think, kind of one of the tricky parts about sort of explaining this issue to the public, is that you're automatically in kind of a defensive position when you have to explain why you kind of know something that is at odds with, the consensus of medical societies at large. And since the UK's CAS report came out, since the Skermeti ruling, since the HHS report on gender dysphoria, all of these organizations have pretty much done the exact same thing, doubled or tripled down, and they very rarely offer any substantive critiques of the other side. So when people refer to systematic reviews or evidence-based medicine, they just kind of ignore all of that and kind of pretend like none of that is relevant.
Good.
Yeah, and I want to toss it out there, because I think that's something that we really delved into and unpacked here at TPPF. One of the problems that we found, and Andrew Brown has done yeoman's work on this, is that there always was threadbare I would say support for these particular policies. If you even look at the chronology of gender dysphoria in its inclusion in the DSM, we really didn't see transgender ideology as an emergent thing. until very recently. And the problem is, of course, is if you have something that completely upends the way we consider. So obviously, if it's in the DSM, it's something that's going on in the brain. It may have physical manifestation as well. But that being said, is we tend to have trouble defining what the actual issue is. But then we jump right to the whole, well, let's start cutting off healthy tissue in order to, approximate this novel understanding of this diagnosis. And so, Dr. Ehrlich, I'd like to actually ask you, as a practitioner, how did you see this from the field? Did you see this turn on a dime? Did you see this come out of nowhere, or is it more of like slowly crept in over the years?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As a practitioner, my practice definitely, we started to see some of the questioning eke in, through our patients, questioning things. I mean, obviously it was sort of filtering in, but very vague. And I don't treat children, so these are mostly young adults who maybe are just have some kind of questioning, things like that. It wasn't overwhelming though, and it didn't slowly come on. It basically just sort of appeared overnight, at least in my estimation. I mean, I know that there were things going on before, but all of a sudden it's actually part of the infrastructure and the thread that actually is, in clinical practice, it's showing up. And the way that I kind of see it is, if you remember in the 80s and 90s, and you probably don't because I'm a lot older than you guys, but we had multiple personality disorder, SIBL, and everyone knew about it. And it was kind of a thing for about 10 years. And this idea that a human being could have multiple different things living inside of them, that went away. That was coded in the DSM. And it went away. We call it something called dissociative disorder now. But, during that time that it was at the forefront, there was actually entertained that these things were inside of the person. The difference with multiple personality disorder and sort of gender dysphoria now is, as I see it, is we didn't do medication or surgeries to treat multiple personality disorder. And now what we do is we treat it completely differently because we know it's a dissociation. There's a mechanism that, and I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm speaking kind of outside my league here, but I feel like we're on that kind of an arc, the multiple personality disorder, which we're all adults. So, these are people with formed psyches and that kind of stuff. When I started seeing the children, and I have 3 kids. They're 22, 20, and 17 now. And I saw their friends starting to entertain these. So when people say, oh, it's 1 out of 100,000 or it's very rare, I was witnessing it as just living in the community, not only just in healthcare.
And people have talked about that being a social contagion. Do you think that that's more of what you saw, which was, people are, learning about it through social media, or their friends are having issues or whatever, and so it just sort of catches on that way?
Yes, I think it's very well laid out now, and the CAST study, I think, by the way, I'm going to say something. I didn't know anything about any of this in 2022. Mm-hmm. I started to see the inklings in 23. And so when we're only talking about a couple of years, and once I saw things, once you see it, you can't unsee it, but I didn't know anything about this. But I'm going to say about the CAST study, they found that a lot of these children are either on the spectrum. Many of them are homosexual. They're gay and lesbian, maybe gender nonconforming. Or with the inklings of that being formed, which we know that being gay is not a mental illness. We've clarified that. So these kids had a lot of comorbidities, and so really, as far, these are the most vulnerable. So children are vulnerable to people in power anyway. They're teachers, and their doctors and the people around them and their social milieu that they live in. But all of these things seem to be working in one lockstep to bring this as a reality to children. I don't really know how that happened, but it really did. It really did happen.
And let me just clarify, because you said out of your lane, and obviously you know much more about medicine than the three other guys on this chat. One thing I do want to ask, though, because I think this is kind of one of the emergent theories, whether it's true or not, and I'd like to float it by you, is that we essentially saw WPATH and such groups had that capture of I would say endocrinology, which is where we saw most of the I would say most of the activism, especially most of the medical activism in this space. Now, do you suppose that it kind of festered from there because if a particular subdiscipline tends to have some sort of, extant theory, that other, that other disciplines, internal medicine, all the other one, family medicine, just basically say, well, if the endocrinologists are there, then it's probably right. Or was there some sort of professional deference that kind of let the wildfire spread, if you will?
Yeah, so this idea of science by consensus and offset, loading off expertise or considering the experts of folks that are in these fields and saying, well, I don't know as much about it. So I'm going to, what do the endocrinologists think? And I think that there was an element of that. When I came up through medical school and residency, we were very evidence-based, looking at real studies. And I don't remember really any activism. I mean, it was, scientific discovery was always happening. And we had some humility, I want to say, at that time, that maybe everything we're doing is not exactly right. We're always in a mode of discovery, and scientific process actually requires people to ask the question: is this doesn't make sense? Do we need to look at this more? And we change our recommendations or what we or how we see things, how we treat things pretty regularly in medicine, because as more information comes to light, we naturally need to make those. We can't just live by dogma alone. But yeah, there has been an offset, and the WPATH is not really a truly scientific. This isn't scientists working on the bench.
That's
right?
An understatement.
Okay. Just to be clear, this is a clearly activist organization. And, I don't have to tell you, you probably know all of this, but using the WPATH and then other organizations, medical organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the AMA and the endocrinologist societies as evidence for how we should treat people, how we should treat children with this very complicated disorder, which is, these kids really do need help. I mean, we need to be treating these kids with the utmost compassion, but also with the idea that we want to make them better. We want to heal them. We want them not to suffer, and that takes constant discovery, especially for new things on the block.
Joe, let me jump back to you on this issue of professional consensus. It was jarring for most of us when we saw how quickly things turned, and then you had these multiple professional organizations, the Association, for pediatricians, and the American Medical Association, all these coming out recommending these types of awful things, things for kids. You talk about in your report about institutional capture. There's clearly an agenda here on the radical left and far left to use these professional organizations to promote gender ideology. What did you learn about how institutional capture happens at organizations like the TMA?
Well, I had a theory in advance about, how, like a working theory of how capture works in organizations. And the HHS report on gender dysphoria actually has a section on medical societies and kind of explains that what tends to happen in areas of like emerging medicine or very highly, like, which gender affirming care is like a highly specialized kind of novel medical field, is that organizations often defer to these kind of ideologically insular subcommittees, and kind of defer to their expertise. And I think the TMA situation was a good example of that, where basically the organization was allowing a group of people an LGBTQ health section. They were seen as the de facto experts on affirming care, and they basically were put in positions through being on committees, councils that are reviewing evidence, making recommendations to the House of Delegates. I would say they have disproportionate influence to kind of shape the organization's policies on affirming care.
Is it just the silence of the good people? Because, I mean, Dr. Ehrlich writes in her piece that the TMA was elevating gender-affirming care as a centerpiece of political advocacy, even though only 1% of members ranked it as a top priority. So did you find that, the silence of the good people or people who did not agree with this just because they weren't part of that section, they were deferring to them to avoid conflict, or what was going on internally?
I think there's definitely an element of that where members are implicitly scared of voicing their opinion. And part of that is, I think, due to the organization's stance in general on affirming care, where it's often, well, not even often, it's explicitly contextualized as, an extension of civil rights, where the TMA has another policy on non-discrimination in healthcare, and gender identity is a category that's in there, and they basically imply that not offering affirming care is inherently discriminatory. And I think most members probably don't want to be seen as opposing affirming care and then being accused of anti-transgender hate or discrimination, whatever it might be. I think that's a huge part of it. And then I think another part of it is members not necessarily probably feeling confident weighing in on this area, because it is sort of unusual in a lot of ways, that they think it's just far outside their area of expertise, when I think if more doctors kind of used their normal training and judgment and applied it to the same issue, we probably wouldn't be in this situation.
Well, Dr. Ehrlich, as somebody who was on the inside, did you feel pressure? Did you feel intimidation to not speak up? I mean, obviously you've grown out of that, if that's the case, because you published a piece in the Dallas Morning News, thankfully, to educate all of Texas about what was going on. But what did you feel like on the inside?
Yeah, I'm not the most popular person. I definitely, there are a lot of really wonderful people at TMA. And it is an organization that's very near and dear to my heart. I've spent more than 25 years in leadership and volunteer service to that organization to promote. It's a 501c6, so it's a professional organization to promote physicians, and we've got all sorts of really, really big problems. And so we were always a one big tent kind of an organization, very cohesive. And this was a pretty recent change and shift. And I'm going to say around 2019, we put in the women's section. We added the first identity section, which was the women's section. And in 2019, then the LGBTQ section, the second identity section. And I think that those were either, I don't think it was organic, but they did come into being, and it may not have been the purpose, but they sort of went into our governance structure in a very odd way. And it opened up. Now we started talked more about a lot of the cultural social issues that were in the community, no doubt about it. But there was a culture shift away from talking about the things that really are impacting physicians, and kind of toward these items. And then it just naturally became politicized. I think these are inherently political issues. So from the inside, yeah, I I think I was. I mean, I'm going to say this vainly that I think I was a pretty well respected leader. And I'm going to say I'm a good doctor. I've been practicing full time all the way through all my babies for almost 30 years here in Texas, and so I enjoyed that reputation, and it was a safer place for me to come and speak out because they don't attack the ideas, they attack the person. And so I was definitely um, I was on the receiving end of some pretty vicious stuff. And really, I just kept to my guns to talk about the issues. Uh, I have a strong belief in the treatment of human beings in a pro-human kind of way. And it's really the center of my ethos. And so it's kept me really balanced and steady through that. I've met a lot of really wonderful people who are also courageous. But to Joe's point, it's a scary place to be. And I think there are a lot of people a lot of even leaders and participants at TMA that it just couldn't stomach it. It was kind of scary. And when you see somebody who goes from being, the president of Harris County Medical Society in 2017, well respected, and on the board of trustees for 3 years, to go to being completely marginalized and villainized, which is really what happened. I think that actually sent a signal to a lot of TMA members and people that really kind of cared about the old stuff that we used to care about, to maybe not say anything.
Well, so you mentioned dogma earlier, and I think this is very instructive because this branch of medicine, or emergent branch of the medicine, I'll say, and this I would say orientation is one of, if not the only branch that actually requires a pre-commitment to a certain ideology. You mentioned that these are inherently political questions, and I completely agree. And so this would be not too dissimilar than if you had someone who is a very devout fundamentalist Christian, we'll say, and they believed in possession. And would we, if somebody was demonstrating, or having manifest of like profound schizophrenia or something like that, would we then try to medically treat them with exorcism? And that is kind of the intellectual equivalent of what we're talking about here. But I want to ask you, using that as a jumping off point, are there any other areas of medicine that requires a pre-commitment to an ideology, that transgenderism even exists, that there's almost a Gnostic understanding of a ghost in the machine, and the ghost got put in the wrong machine, if you will? Is there anything else like that, or is this sui generis?
I think, well, I can say just even at the TMA, it's interesting because we can go all the way back to prefrontal cortex lobotomy, right? That was practiced for way many more decades than it should have been practiced. It was barbaric, and we did that. The Soviet Union actually outlawed that procedure long before we did in the United States. And so there were some forces that were keeping it going here. But I'm going to say that it's an interesting question that you ask about, is that there is the scientific process of discovery, knowing that there's a problem, questioning, having a null hypothesis to test for, possible treatments and things like that. That's always been in existence. But this particular thing bypassed it all. It just went, gender dysphoria just bypassed all of that straight to, this is how you treat it, and how could you not, almost calling it unethical to not do it, which in the old days, I think we would say, when I say old days, like 10 years ago, we would say, if we're going to treat children with interventions, we have to be sure that the harms do not outweigh the benefits. We need to define those harms. And that was just seriously thrown out the window. But this was happening, talking about the ghost in the machine, at the same time that there was a resolution, multiple resolutions that came to the TMA delegate floor in 2021 that declared racism as a healthcare emergency. Those words. So, are we gonna gather up our battlefields and go, attack this sort of devil, right? Or you're saying, the demon, and that's what we define. So this wasn't happening in a vacuum. And of course, remember, it was pandemic. So we also, what happened with the TMA is we went from never recommending mandates because it violated the first pillar of medical ethics, which is respect for autonomy. And that came straight out of the Nuremberg trials. We just don't hold our patients down and make them do things that they don't want to do. We have a model of shared decision making. But during pandemic, all of a sudden now we were for mandates. We were like, yep, you have to go get that medical intervention. And there were resolutions on the floor in the delegation that said we should not do that, and they were voted down. There was one resolution that said the TMA is against mandating medical interventions for patients, and it was soundly defeated.
I want to respond to your question too, Derek. I think for people to understand, there's really three things going on here. The first is gender dysphoria, and we all agree that's a real thing that needs to be treated and has been treated for decades. Yeah. The second thing is the treatment. What is the right treatment for gender dysphoria? And there are treatments that we know work, and one of them is studies will show that 8 or 9 out of 10 kids who are just allowed to go through puberty will effectively grow out.
Doing nothing is a choice. I think Geddy Lee said that.
Right.
Geddy Lee of Rush.
The wise philosopher Geddy Lee. But that's the second question: is what do you do? Gender dysphoria is the medical condition. The second question is what do you do with kids who have gender dysphoria? And then the third question is gender ideology, which is the sort of the transgenderism, which is the philosophical approach or belief that there's something like a man can be inside of a woman, which doesn't make any sense if the words man and woman mean anything, and we don't have to go down that road. But I think that's what the transgenderists do, is they conflate all three of those things. And to your point, they force you through the ideological prism first, and then you can handle, what is gender dysphoria and how do you treat it? Yeah. When for decades, doctors not like Dr. Ehrlich, but doctors who have been treating, the pediatric endocrinologists have been treating gender dysphoria as a medical condition and have had, the things that work while being able to reject sort of the ideological stuff that's coming in. I think that's really what our side needs to think about. This is when you're talking about this with people, realize that like what the left is doing here is they are conflating all of those three things.
No, you're absolutely correct. And one of the things that I point out specifically, if you have somebody who is suffering from some severe suicidality, affirming the problem is the absolute last thing that you want to do. But here we almost say that, okay, even if you look at it through the more sterile lens of the DSM-5's or the DSM's orientation on gender dysphoria, it still requires that pre-commitment again to the ideology, like you said. And so what I fail to see the folks taking up this. When I say folks taking up the mantle, I want to make sure that are pushing us further in this direction, is actually grappling with the fact that even post-treatment, suicidality as a phenomenon within the subgroup is not mitigated by amputation, which is what it is. It's amputation. It's not mitigated by amputation. It's not mitigated by hormones. And in fact, we see a whole bunch of iatrogenic effects from when we actually use hormones as a medical intervention for this particular disease, because we're just, pardon pardon the euphemism, we're just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah. Joe, what did you find out, or what do you know about where this is all coming from? I mean, is there a George Soros check at the end of this thing? I mean, how does this happen that people's minds, you talk about, Gad Saad's parasitic mind and all of that. I mean, there's probably a lot of that going on, but do you find like that there is a well-funded, well-resourced, movement behind all of this that is using things like, organizations like the TMA to push their agenda forward? What did you find out?
I wouldn't say it comes from one source. I would just say that I think the proliferation of the idea of a gender identity specifically, I mean, that has been, I think, instrumental in shaping people's views and a lot of people have made this point, but for regular people, they often associate, and this is partly the way that the LGBT umbrella kind of works, is people assume that transgender identity must be very similar to being gay, and it must be innate and immutable. And I think that when people think that this is an innate, immutable quality, they start thinking about it in terms of this kind of civil rights angle, and then it becomes less about, an underlying treatment for a disorder and more about, supporting civil rights. And I think it's important to note too that the TMA's official position is a lot closer to the ideological kind of paradigm you described, because their policy does not mention gender dysphoria. It's explicit that the care should be made available to anyone with an alternative gender identity, and that's, I don't even think you could really call that medicine in the traditional sense, because what you have here is this gender incongruence or gender diversity paradigm. It's called. It's just like, okay, having an alternative gender identity or being gender nonconforming, and they conflate the two of them often, is just another way of being in the world, and it's not a pathology. It shouldn't be stigmatized. Well, then, of course, if that's true, then how could the treatment simultaneously be medically necessary? Because you're not now treating an underlying pathology or condition. So it's kind of an incoherent position, and it's not medicine in the sense that you're not doing a kind of risk-benefit calculus for if this is, in the best interest of a patient. It's just like, it should be made available to the patient because their identity is, insert whatever identity it is.
I don't disagree that what you're saying is that there are people who are committed to this from an ideological perspective. I absolutely think that there are, unfortunately, doctors who are doing that. But I'm going to try and be cynical again one more time and say that there's a lot of money here. I mean, as a doctor who treats these kids, it's a cash cow to force these kids into these procedures and these hormones, because as pediatric endocrinologists have told us on this show, you're making a patient for life. And I can only imagine what the venture capitalists, the evil venture capitalists would say about an entire field that creates a new kind of patient who will start being a patient when they're 15 years old and be a patient for the rest of their entire life.
Objectively speaking, it's a lucrative industry. I mean, and I do think there are clear financial incentives for certain people and organizations to keep the train moving. But I also think like the push to make gender identity and gender diversity and gender incongruence like just in the mainstream, I think is done by a lot of trans identifying people and activists themselves that are not necessarily like personally benefiting financially, but they see it as kind of their mission to kind of proselytize this idea. I think thinking of probably in a way to kind of justify, I'm speculating here about like individual psychological motivations, but to justify like their own choices and self-perception and things like that. Because I mean, the activist organizations are clearly a powerful lobbying bloc.
Good.
Well, and I want to ask about that, because I really want to explore the interplay between the associations and the boards. So across all states, specifically in Texas. So obviously the association itself, very powerful, I would say, player in the field, but they don't actually have any governmental or plenary authority over the practice of medicine.
No.
So that being said, how do those bodies, and then this could be an open question for both of our panelists here, how do those bodies interplay, and do we see one subsuming the other, or do we just see, like, what was it they used to say, Mark Twain said about Cincinnati, that when the end of the world comes, he'd want to be there because it gets there 10 years too late? Is that the same dynamic that we have with the, something that happens at the association through the course of time will eventually happen within the board?
Are you talking about the Texas Medical Board?
Mm.
The license, yeah. So yes, the Texas Medical Board is, the official licensing of, they oversee the Medical Practices Act and make sure that all the doctors that are practicing in Texas abide by the Medical Practices Act. There is a heavy overlap between TMA and TMB, just for the people that are on. Their TMA members tend to be pretty active on the Texas Medical Board. That's appointed by the governor. Those positions are appointed by the governor. But the TMA does, but even though we don't have any plenary authority, we do set, and Joe can speak to this in the LGBTQ section, we do influence the legislator. We have very powerful, we have great lobbyists. We do influence policy in Texas, and also as respected people, leaders who know medicine. We are respected, and so there is a lean on TMA for having power over that, and the board, interaction obviously is there. If that answers your question.
Joe, well, this is actually a question for both of y'all. But we'll start with the think tank guy. What would you like to see in terms of policies? Like, how do we? I mean, is Texas doing the right thing? I mean, that's kind of what I was really wanted to know is, what do you think of what Texas has done so far? Do you think it's helping to protect kids? And then, are there policies that can be, promoted at the legislative or state level that would, I guess TMA is a private organization, so they can do whatever they want to do. If they want to be whack jobs, they can. But obviously, to Dr. Ehrlich's point, they do have a lot of influence. And so you just wonder about how, are there policies, in place that will protect, like, how is Texas doing in terms of protecting kids and not allowing this kind of influence to take place?
Well, I think Texas is doing a good job. I mean, you have SB 14 as we discussed. What's interesting in this case is that the TMA is actually like directly at odds with the position of the state of Texas, which officially does not allow physicians, or there's penalties for physicians to render affirming care. So in that way, they've done what they can, and that actually should be enforced in a way by the medical board. So the medical board and is on the same side. So the medical board should also be at odds then with the TMA's stance as well. So I think they're trying to do what they've already done, really what they can do to kind of prohibit these practices. In terms of solving like the TMA situation, that's more of like a governance problem, and I think like there are things that could be done on a policy level to kind of ensure. I saw one member had a very interesting idea to ensure that when there are positions made by TMA involving questions of evidence, that the evidence should need to be reviewed in advance, that it has to be because apparently on the affirming care thing, some of the committees allegedly never looked at any of the evidence submitted in opposition. And so if you force them to actually grapple with the evidence and like apply, evidence-based medicine standards, if that was, in place before, there's no way you could have passed this policy, because by those standards, it's objectively false that the practice is evidence-based. A lot of people just say it's evidence-based, and what they mean is that like a single study somewhere has said that there might be benefits for a treatment. But in evidence-based medicine, a single study, especially like a non-representative study, which has no ability to causally determine if an intervention works, that's functionally meaningless and shouldn't represent the entire state of the evidence. And, I wrote another piece this week on TMA's CME on transgender healthcare, which is sponsored by their LGBTQ health section. And that's exactly what they do, where a member presents on the state of the evidence. And remember, this is for ethics credits for physicians for continuing medical education. That they present studies that have been debunked for years, that are not representative. They don't cite any systematic reviews at all, and they're fundamentally, misleading members about this particular area of care, and they misrepresent the risk-benefit ratio of treatment. And obviously, that's a huge problem. And if you were enforcing evidence standards, you would never be able to put this out into the world.
Dr. Ehrlich, I mean, from someone who was on the inside and a trustee at TMA, is that kind of approach, do you think that would work to try and put the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak, with a TMA, or is an organization like that lost now that the parasites have taken over?
Well, it definitely is a culture issue, and once the culture sort of allows this sort of thing to happen, I mean, once it becomes the norm, it is hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube. And that I really, when I was on the inside and sort of when I was on the board of trustees, my approach to this was, you approach the problem. If you can't get by that, you approach the governance. If you can't get by with that, then I don't know what you're going to do next.
You publish an op-ed in the Dallas Morning News as a last-ditch effort to go to the left-wing media to see if they'll even pay attention.
Yes, and it's exactly right. So that was, where I'm clanging the bell, and basically what I was saying on the inside was, hey, that house is on fire. I see the smoke coming out, and instead of the leadership and the top staffers, instead of going, maybe we should send some fire trucks over there, they send the police to come and cart me off and put a gag in my mouth. And that was the sort of approach to it. So that didn't work. So but I did that out of, because I really do want us to get back to that, open discovery, curiosity, collegiality of people talking about where we come together as one, as one force to do the best things for the profession of medicine and for our patients. Like, that simple. And, I'd say the identity sections probably are divisive. They're divisive everywhere, not just at TMA. Those don't fit in governance. They can be, those need to change. That was one of the very naive things I first went after, being a woman, that I was on the women's section, and I was actually involved in setting the women's section in the original mission, and that didn't go well. It's kind of like, people get entrenched in their camps, and they don't want to let go of that. That was an element of power. And they were able, as a section, and actually they and the LGBTQ section, and this was in Joe's report, very well footnoted, by the way. And what I didn't know the extent of this until I read Joe's report. That needs to be fixed by the board, who has the fiduciary to do that for the good of the organization. But it's hard to.
If I could just add one thing to Lisa's point too, one of the paradoxes and big issues here is that the kind of committees or councils that would naturally be a check on these things, because they're supposed to be the experts, are the ones failing in their function. And that's not an easy fix, unless that's why you need leadership who has the ability to kind of to address this. They need to actually want to do it. Otherwise, you're just going to have broken checks and balances, which is what you have now, where you have multiple committees signing off on, for example, in the 2025 House of Delegates, that resolution I discussed earlier about an ad hoc committee to evaluate TMA's current policies was shot down by the Council on Science and Public Health and by the Committee on Child and Adolescent Health. And so those are the expert bodies that normally would be like, hey, there's a problem here, but they're the ones that are pushing for it. And so that just creates an inherent problem because there's no way out of that besides an overhaul.
As we wrap up here, one more question for each of you, Joe, and this kind of what you're talking about kind of dovetails into this is, obviously this is a continuing problem. It feels like, in these organizations, it's getting worse and it's pushing out, good doctors and good people like Dr. Ehrlich. What's the next shoe to drop? I mean, even though it feels like the public is turning on this and that things are moving in the right direction and policymakers and lawmakers are all moving in the right direction, organizations like TMA, again, back to the top, are doubling down. As you continue to look through this, are you, what's the next shoe to drop? What are you looking at to see what the next, the next awful thing that we're gonna find out about what's going on?
I think at some point it will become just untenable for medical associations to just continuously state that what they're doing is evidence-based by the standards of evidence-based medicine and standard practice. I mean, you could point to the medical practice reversals in other countries. You can now point to the HHS report on gender dysphoria, which was recently peer-reviewed a few days ago. They released a new supplement. It's been peer-reviewed by evidence-based medicine experts. I think people really need to take that report extremely seriously. It's arguably probably the most comprehensive document on evidence and treatment for gender dysphoria in existence. I would say probably more comprehensive in some ways than the CAS report. I think that document is an opportunity to kind of reestablish the treatment for gender dysphoria on scientific grounds. And I think that as soon as one or two medical associations start to flip, you'll see like a permission structure created for others to be able to do the same.
And for you, Dr. Ehrlich, as somebody who has faced the intimidation and the vicious attacks and yet stood up and spoke out anyway, what is your advice to folks who might be in your shoes right now, who really don't like what's going on, but are not sure if they should put their reputation and maybe even their livelihood on the line to speak out about this? If you could talk to them and offer them some advice, what would you say?
Well, I'm a kind of a Pollyanna. I feel like I have a lot of optimism around this. I do think things are going to Joe's point, I do think things are going to continue to break and fall apart, until something happens. But I think out of that is going to be something really good and maybe more clarity, more simplicity about what our mission and focus is. As leaders, we're doctors first, we're physician leaders, but we're physicians first, and we have an absolute responsibility and obligation to the treatment of our patients in the old William Osler paradigm. And this isn't a 9-to-5 job. So it doesn't matter what our CV looks like if our patients are healthy. So I don't need accolades and awards and humanitarian awards and all of that stuff. I don't need to say I was in the board for, or the president of this or that. What I need at the end of the day is for my patients to be healthy and thriving, and for the environment to treat them in to be the best that it can be. And that was always my goal, and why I volunteer for TMA all of those years. But if it's not doing that function, then it's going to fail, because that's what the purpose of medical organizations is, especially the 501c6s. I think making a plan for what comes out of the ashes of that. I think I'm of the personality type that says, okay, that wasn't so good, but what next? Let's make a pivot and do something better. And my advice for other people is refocus on why you do what you do. Practicing physicians are just by nature generally very compassionate people, and I think that's why we're also vulnerable, right? And we're shy about these things, but we have to we have to stand up, because if we don't, I hit this point where I started to feel every child that was entered into this medicalization who was going to be changed for life as something that if I could have prevented it, I needed to get in there and make sure that this just stops happening. And it was really that moment that I just got a brave, there were other really, really brave people that went before me, and I'm not really all that brave. I'm just kind of a hardhead.
Derek, we always, to the best of my ability, I try to end the show on the famous quote from Sam Houston, which is do good and risk the consequences. And I think that certainly your message there to other people, and that message from Sam Houston is more apt than it has ever been on an issue like this. Well, thank you, Dr. Ehrlich. This has been a great discussion. There's obviously more to watch and more to talk about, but this is a good place to wrap it up here. Dr. Ehrlich, thank you so much for what you do and for speaking up and for publicizing this. And of course, Joe, thank you so much for your work that prompted Dr. Ehrlich to write this piece and the research that you've done. I would ask our audience to go and visit your materials at the Manhattan Institute's website there. You can find his report as well as others, and then keep tabs on whatever Joe is going to be publishing next. So Dr. Ehrlich and Joe, thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you so much. It was really nice to meet you guys.
You too.
And thank you to our listeners and to our watchers. We really appreciate you listening to this really important debate. In the immortal words of Sam Houston, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.